Good afternoon. It's another beautiful day in lockdown. Today, I want to record a video that explains and addresses quite a serious subject, something that people don't really understand a lot about, um, but it affects pretty much all of us, even if we don't realize it, and that is trauma. So, what is trauma? If you would look at the dictionary definition of it, it would probably say something like a physical response to a distressing or disturbing event, something like that. Now, that's why we would say that was really traumatic. But it doesn't just stop there. It's bad enough that what happened to us in the moment was particularly distressing, but actually, because of the way that the brain processes trauma, or rather it doesn't process it properly, it means that it can actually cause problems later on. And I'm going to explain that in quite a bit of detail now, hopefully in a way that is quite accessible and easy to understand for people. Because this is the thing, when you understand something, or understand what is happening to you and why, it's suddenly not as frightening as it is if we really don't know why we're feeling the way that we feel or we're having that kind of reaction. Because trauma can lead to things like panic attacks, it can lead to PTSD, which is post-traumatic stress disorder. So what I'm going to do is first of all explain how the brain responds to a traumatic event, and then how that can actually affect us later on, and then I'll try and finish with some good news at the end. So let's get into it. So before we actually talk about what happens during trauma, let's just get a sense of what's going on normally. So as you're going about your day, you've got your five senses, and you're basically taking information in through those five senses. And as I've mentioned a couple of times in some videos, you've got some things behind your eyes in the emotional center of your brain, in the limbic system, called the amygdala, or the amygdalae, if you want to do the plural bit. So basically, what are those doing? They are sensors that are taking in those bits of data, because your sensory information, it's not real time actually. It's sort of, if you think about it, it's converted. Like, you get waves that come into your ears, that then gets converted into sound and stored that way. Eyes, you're recording stuff. These aren't cameras. They're basically taking the information, and then it gets turned into a visual representation in your brain. And they're all doing that. Like, your tongue is taking information, it gets converted into information. So the only sense that is in real time is smell, because when you smell, you take scent directly into your brain, which means it's reading it in real time. And actually, it doesn't get stored, so if you can't actually really remember a smell. Like, you can kind of remember how it made you feel, but if you try and actually remember the smell, it's a weird thing. I actually spent quite some time trying to do that once, and have a go. It'll bend your mind a little bit. Okay, so let me explain. So as I said, we're taking in the information through our five senses. It goes into that amygdala, and it's actually being filtered through the front of your brain, because the front part of your brain is kind of the interpreter. It kind of takes that information, it makes sense of it, okay? So it's all correlated, it's collected, and then it has a conversation with the front part of your brain. It understands it, it kind of then processes that information, it tells a story about it, it gives it the stamp of approval, and then it kind of moves it from the hippocampus up into the cerebral cortex, into your long-term memory eventually. Now, that's the way it should be working normally. However, when you experience a disturbing or a distressing event, the amygdala behaves differently, because the amygdala's real job is to search out for danger. It's like an alarm system, the gatekeeper, if you like. And as it's looking out for that, if something happens, it's a very different situation that's shocking. So the thing with trauma is, it comes out of nowhere. It's usually a shock. You're very emotional and stressed already, and then it goes into that, and it basically thinks, right, that is dangerous. That is a problem. And therefore, I don't have time to have that nice conversation and loop it through the front part of the brain. So what I'm going to do is take a snapshot of that raw data, and I'm going to store that in the hippocampus, which is next door to the amygdala, which is a bit like a large library. Now, the reason that it wants to keep it there is so it can be accessed quickly in a hurry. So long-term memory is up in the cerebral cortex, but this short-term memory here, which is electrical, is in the hippocampus. Now, the problem with this is that because it's done all this in a hurry, it hasn't processed it, and therefore it doesn't understand the information. All that it knows is that that information that is captured signifies some kind of danger, and if something similar happens, if it looks a bit like that, sounds a bit like that, smells a bit like that, all the rest of it, feels a bit like that, then it's going to instantly put you into that survival, fight or flight or freeze mechanism. There is actually another one, which is you actually faint, but that's quite rare, but it does actually happen. So basically what we've got now is stored raw information that can be triggered at any time if the amygdala thinks that what is going on out here is something similar to that. Now, this could be, this is why things like panic attacks and things like that can be formed from this. Because think about it, something is oversensitive, sensitive, right? It's now looking out for things and it's kind of on guard, but it really doesn't understand the information, so it's overly sensitive. So for example, if you're, I don't know, in a supermarket and you subconsciously hear a voice that sounds like the voice of someone that attacked you once upon a time, the amygdala's like, that, I know that sound, and instantly you're in fight or flight. And if you're someone that's prone to really taking it to a later stage, that could turn into a full panic attack or something like that. And the person will have no idea why. They haven't even consciously picked up on that sound and recognized that. They probably can't even remember being attacked. It was so long ago. It could have been something during childhood. And that's the other thing to consider. There isn't just one kind of trauma here. It's relevant or relative to the individual. So something that is incredibly traumatic to one person might be completely nothing to another person. So never compare yourself to someone else and say, well, I wasn't raped, I wasn't really badly abused, and therefore what right do I have to kind of get really affected by something, whereas that person over there went through that. It kind of doesn't work like that. Your brain is unique to you and your experience is subjective. So bringing it back to that example, it can be about anything, and also it can really be a case of whatever you were facing at the time when something traumatic was happening can be included in what it considers to be a dangerous thing. I had a client fairly recently who had, this is how phobias are created as well, because something traumatic happens, it captures that information, and then over time that becomes a pattern and you can create anxiety and everything else around it, but it starts with a trauma. So this woman was, and it happened by accident, because she came to me because she had a phobia of raw meat, which is kind of a weird idea. Not many people have that, and she didn't understand it either, because she likes to eat meat, not raw, but she likes to eat meat. So she really couldn't understand it, and what I said to her was, have you ever had a stressful experience while you were cooking? And out of nowhere she was like, oh my God, yes. I was in a new house, we had a gas cooker, I'd never used a gas cooker before, and when I was preparing a meal, and when I lit the gas stove, it blew up in my face. And she kind of turned away, and what she'd done is, as she turned away, she'd been looking at the meat that she was preparing, and the amygdala had just taken a snapshot of that and all of the rest of the information, and then over a period of time, suddenly she's terrified of touching or smelling or seeing raw meat. Now, that's really important, because if you have a strange phobia, it could well be because something stressful was happening and you just happened to be focusing on. I had a bus driver who had a phobia of going over a bridge, because he'd had a stressful moment as a driver and he was going over a bridge at the time, and he looked out the window and seen the bridge. But again, if you don't know that, you can't really understand why every time you go over a bridge or you look at raw meat, you're having that kind of panic attack not panic attack, but a traumatic response happening. So there you go. You've got that raw data there. So basically, as a therapist, what we have to do is we have to get you to revisit that original memory or experience without triggering the amygdala, so that you're able to have that conversation and process it properly with the prefrontal cortex, so that it's understood, it's made safe, and the emotion is released safely in a controlled way, so that whenever your amygdala then sees that stimulant or that thing again, it doesn't get triggered by it, because we've released it and it's now moved up into the long-term memory and it's labeled, given the stamp of approval for being safe. So what is PTSD? PTSD is basically when you've experienced a traumatic event that's so strong that whenever you come back to say you're a soldier and you've experienced something in a war zone, and then because you were very seriously traumatized, again, the raw data is stored there, and then things happen which trigger you, and then in extreme cases you can actually start to relive it. You can see it, you can almost feel like you're there, and you lose a sense of reality in its most extreme. And if that keeps happening, we call that post-traumatic stress disorder. So I hope that's explained a bit about that. Ending on a good note is, this is quite an easy thing to treat. Just again, wanting to make sure there's two kinds of trauma. There's trauma with a big T, things like car crashes, being abused, war zones, things like that. And there's little t, basically it's any kind of event that you've experienced where you had a emotional response that was sort of quite strong. So just because you haven't been involved in what you would think is a really traumatic experience doesn't mean that you don't have any trauma. And when you are under stress, or when you are in situations like we are now in lockdown, then these triggers can get tripped quite easily, especially if we're not really looking after ourselves properly. So I guess what I'd like to finish on is just to say, look, if you are struggling, this is something that can be sorted out in just a few sessions. So don't suffer, get in touch, put your hand up. There's a lot we can do. I train other people how to do this, so I know it works, and they've all come back with fantastic results. And I'm available. I've got a lot of time on my hands. I'm offering half-price sessions at the moment. If you want to ask any questions about trauma, if I didn't feel like I covered enough for you, then get in touch if you're just curious. But look after yourselves. Get some sunshine. Honestly, it'll make a big difference to you, and I hope that was helpful.